Imagine a quiet summer evening in the Texas countryside. The air is heavy with the smell of dry earth and sun-baked grass. Somewhere in the distance, a lone cicada begins its evening song, slow and deliberate, as if the world has nowhere to go and nothing urgent to do. In this stillness, it is difficult to imagine that the boy who once walked these dusty roads would someday stand alone on a burning tank, his legs wounded, holding the line against waves of enemy soldiers. But history often hides its sharpest turns behind the plainest beginnings. And so, it was with Audie Leon Murphy, a boy from Hunt County, Texas, who would become the most decorated American soldier of the Second World War. Murphy was born on June 20th, 1925, into a family that had little to give beyond hard work and quiet endurance. His father would leave when he was still small. His mother, Josie, carried the weight of raising 12 children in a home where meals were modest and dreams were even smaller. Yet to Murphy, she was the most beautiful person he had ever known. Her hair, so long it nearly brushed the ground, her voice soft, her silences deep. He would later say that when she died, when he was just 16, she took something with her, a part of him he would search for consciously, or not for the rest of his life. School ended early for Murphy. The 5th grade was the last classroom he would see. There was work to be done, picking cotton under the blistering Texas sun, taking on odd jobs for coins that would stretch the family's food supply, and hunting small game to bring a little extra to the table. With each rabbit, each squirrel, his aim grew steady. His rifle was not a toy, but a tool of survival. When news of the attack on Pearl Harbor came crackling through the radio in December 1941, the boy from Hunt County felt the call as sharply as any man old enough to serve. He tried the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, each one turning him away. Too young, too light, too small. But Murphy had a stubborn streak as wide as the Texas plains. With the help of his older sister, he added a year to his age on paper, tipping himself just over the requirement. On June 30th, 1942, the U.S. Army finally said yes. Training molded him quickly. He learned not only to shoot, but to move, to listen, to read the land and the sound of distant engines. In marksmanship, he excelled his skill, with a rifle earning him recognition even before he set foot on foreign soil. By February 20th, 1943, he was sailing toward the Mediterranean, a young private in the 3rd Infantry Division, bound for the campaigns in Sicily and Italy. War for Murphy began as a series of violent welcomes, the chaotic beach landings, the sharp bursts of gunfire echoing against hillsides, the quick, deadly lessons that only combat could teach. Through the summer and into autumn, he climbed the ranks, proving himself under fire again and again. In Sicily, in San Fratello, in Salerno, he moved like a shadow between cover and open ground, his rifle steady, his judgment quick. Promotions came. So did sickness, malaria striking him down in Naples in January 1944. Forcing him to miss the opening of the Anzio landings. But by the end of that month, he was back with his unit, the rhythm of combat, already second nature. And then there were moments, brief, bright, and terrible, that would stay with him. An enemy tank, its crew destroyed by grenades thrown from desperate hands. A friend felled by bullets in the instant after would-be surrender turned to treachery. In one French village, Murphy cleared a house single-handedly, killing 6, wounding 2, capturing 11. These were not stories told for glory. They were for Murphy facts of life in a war that never seemed to sleep. By August 1944, During the Allied landings in southern France, he had already seen more death than many men twice his age. In a vineyard near Ramatuelle, when German fire pinned down his squad, he fought back with the focus of someone who understood that hesitation meant the end. In October in the Vosges Mountains, he crawled alone toward an enemy position, a radio at his side, directing artillery, even as bullets cracked over his head. When the hill was taken, the toll on the enemy was counted: 15 dead, 35 wounded. But for Murphy, the cost was not in numbers. The cost was in faces, in voices silenced forever. And still the war had not yet asked its greatest price from him. That price would come in January 1945 in a place called the Colmar Pocket, in the bitter cold of the French winter. Here snow lay heavy on the ground, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and frozen pine. The enemy held firm across a wide stretch of land, and the battle to take it back would be fierce. On the day that would define his name in history, Murphy was already wounded in both legs. Yet, when an enemy shell struck an American tank destroyer, setting it ablaze and forcing its crew to retreat, he did not step back. Instead, he ordered his men to fall back into the shelter of the woods, leaving himself alone on the open field. Bullets stitched the earth around him as he climbed onto the burning M10. He gripped the heavy .50 caliber machine gun mounted there and began firing long, controlled bursts that tore into the advancing German infantry. For an hour he held them. His own body exposed the heat of the flames behind him, the bite of cold air on his face. He called in artillery fire by radio, guiding shells closer and closer to his position, never breaking his rhythm on the gun. When at last the enemy faltered, the snow in front of his position was marked by the fallen, 50 dead or wounded, and the rest in retreat. Murphy, still bleeding, rejoined his men and led the counterattack that drove the enemy completely from the field. For this, he would be awarded the Medal of Honor. And yet to those who knew him, this was simply Murphy being Murphy, a man who, when the world seemed certain to fall apart, would plant his feet and hold it together. The war would end. Murphy would return home, his chest heavy with medals, his name in headlines. But inside, the war would never leave him. The dreams, the sudden bursts of memory, the quiet dread, these would be his companions for the rest of his life. In time, he would find new roles as an actor, a writer, even a singer. He would live under the bright lights of Hollywood, yet keep a piece of himself tucked away unreachable. And on a rainy day in May 1971, in the mountains of Virginia, his life would come to its sudden final end in a plane crash. He was 45 years old. Audie Leon Murphy's grave lies today in Arlington National Cemetery. Visitors often find it without a map, drawn perhaps by some quiet instinct, as if the story of the boy from Hunt County still calls to anyone who has ever wondered what courage looks like when it is stripped of all the noise and ceremony. This is his story, and it begins long before the fire and the gun smoke, in the silence of a Texas evening, where a boy once dreamed of wearing a soldier's uniform, and where the cicadas still sing in the slow rhythm of the fading day. The flatlands of Hunt County, Texas, could be unforgiving in the 1920s. Summers baked the earth into pale dust, and winters carried a chill that slid beneath the doors of wooden farmhouses. For families like the Murphys, the land was both provider and taskmaster, offering what it could, demanding labor in return. Audie Leon Murphy was born into this rhythm on June 20th, 1925, the seventh of 12 children. His family lived in a small weather-worn home that leaned slightly against the prairie wind. Its boards faded to the color of sun-bleached bone. Inside, the air was often scented with whatever simple meal was stretching to feed so many mouths: beans simmering slowly, cornbread baking, or the faint salt of cured meat when times were a little better. His father, Emmett, was a restless man who drifted in and out of the family's life. There were seasons when he was gone, for weeks at a time, the work he chased rarely enough to ease the weight on Josie Audie's mother. She was the quiet center of the household, her long chestnut brown hair, an anchor of beauty in a world often marked by scarcity. Audie adored her, but even as a boy, he sensed a kind of searching in her, a gaze that seemed to look beyond the walls of their home, as if hoping for something she could not name. Years later, he would speak of her with a tenderness that never faded, recalling how she rarely spoke of feelings, and yet carried a depth of emotion in her silence. When she died in 1941, at just 49 years old, Audie was 16. He would say she had taken something with her. When she left a part of him he could never quite find again. Before that loss, life for young Audie had already been a steady march of hard lessons. School was a brief chapter. By the 5th grade, the pull of necessity was stronger than the call of books and chalkboards. He left the classroom for the cotton fields, his small hands quickly learning the prick and scratch of the bowls. Work was relentless. The summer sun pressed down until the air shimmered over the fields, and the muscles in his back ached from hours of stooping. But there were other jobs too, anything that could bring in coins to keep the family afloat. He learned to move from one task to another without complaint. And then there was hunting. In the woods and along the hedgerows, Murphy's rifle became as familiar to him as his own hands. Rabbits, squirrels, and birds found their way into the family's meals thanks to his keen eye and steady aim. Shooting was not a sport. It was a necessity. Each bullet had to count, each shot taken with care. These years shaped him in quiet ways. The discipline of work, the patience of waiting for the right shot, the acceptance of discomfort, they were all threads in the fabric that would later hold him together under fire. When his father finally left for good, the gap he left was less about presence than about burden. The older children took on what they could. The younger ones learned quickly how to fend for themselves. In that mix, Audie found himself somewhere between boyhood and manhood, responsible for more than most his age, yet still carrying the restless dreams of youth. And there was one dream that stood above the rest: to become a soldier. Even before the world was at war, the image of a uniformed man with a rifle standing steady in the face of danger held a certain magic for him. He imagined the pride it would bring not only to himself, but to the memory of his mother, who had always seen something in him that others might overlook. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 made the dream urgent. It was no longer just a boy's wish. It felt like a calling. The radio crackled with the news, and across America, young men began stepping forward. Audie wanted to be among them, but reality had a way of slowing him. The Army said no. The Navy said no. The Marine Corps said no. Too young, too light, too small. The rejection was repeated with the polite finality of military standards. He could have waited. He could have tried again in a year or two. But patience was not his nature when the stakes felt this high. And so, with his sister Corinne's help, he altered his age on paper. Just 1 year older, just enough to slide past the gatekeepers. When the army finally accepted him on June 30th, 1942, he was 17 years old, though his official record said 18. The boy from Hunt County had found his way in. It would not be long before the lessons of the cotton fields and the hunting woods would be tested on battlefields far from Texas. The dust and heat would be replaced by the salt air of distant shores, the sharp crack of hunting rifles by the deafening chaos of war. But for now, the train that carried him away from home was only the first step. Behind him lay the quiet fields of his childhood, the weathered farmhouse, and the voice of his mother echoing somewhere in memory. Ahead lay the unknown, and the long, hard road that would one day turn him into a name spoken with reverence, long after the guns fell silent. The train that carried Audie Murphy away from Texas rolled eastward through the summer heat of 1942. Inside, the air smelled faintly of metal and coal smoke. The benches were hard, the motion steady, the windows framing a blur of fields and small towns slipping past. For Murphy, each mile meant more than distance. It was a crossing from the life he had always known into one he had imagined but never touched. Fort Walters in Mineral Wells, Texas, was where his transformation began. The base spread wide across flat ground, its barracks lined in neat rows, its parade fields shimmering under the sun. The first days were filled with the business of turning civilians into soldiers. Haircuts that left the scalp bare to the air, uniforms stiff, and new boots that rubbed blisters until the skin toughened. Murphy was quiet among his fellow recruits, but his skill with the rifle soon stood out. On the firing range, he settled into the familiar rhythm of breathing, aiming, and squeezing the trigger, the same discipline that had fed his family, now drawing nods from instructors. The sharp crack of the rifle, the small jump against his shoulder, the distant clang of a target, struck all of it felt like second nature. Basic training was more than marksmanship. There were long marches under the Texas sunpacks, heavy with gear. There were drills that tested endurance, patience, and the ability to follow orders without hesitation. Murphy moved through it with a quiet determination, as if each blister, each drop of sweat was a payment toward the life he had wanted for years. Advanced training followed at Fort Meade, Maryland. Here the air was cooler, the terrain a mix of woods and open fields. The days were filled with weapons, drills, tactical exercises, and the constant rhythm of instruction shouted across the training grounds. By the time his training was complete, Murphy was leaner, harder, and sharper ready, at least in body, for whatever lay ahead. On February 20th, 1943, he boarded a ship bound for the Mediterranean. The crossing was long, the sea stretching endlessly in all directions, the days marked by drills, inspections, and the low murmur of men speaking in small groups. The scent of salt water clung to everything, and the sound of the ship's engines was a constant low vibration underfoot. His destination was the island of Sicily. Operation Husky. The Allied invasion was already underway when Murphy's unit arrived. The landings were chaotic, the roar of naval guns offshore, the whine of aircraft overhead, the crack and thump of enemy fire reaching the beaches. The sand was hot underfoot, the air heavy with the scent of cordite and seawater. Murphy moved forward with his squad. Each step measured his eyes, scanning the broken landscape ahead. In the small towns and rugged hills of Sicily, he learned the close, unpredictable nature of combat. Sometimes the enemy was a distant figure, barely visible against the stone and scrub. Other times, they were just across a narrow street, their voices audible, their weapons ready. From Sicily, his unit moved on to the Italian mainland. At Salerno, the fighting was fierce and constant, the days blending into nights without rest. Rain turned the ground to mud, and the air was filled with the mingled sounds of gunfire, shouted orders, and the occasional scream of incoming shells. Murphy adapted quickly, learning to read the terrain, to sense when danger was near to move with both speed and care. In December 1943, he was promoted, recognition of the steadiness he had shown under fire. But with each success came new challenges. In January 1944, illness struck malaria, the fever leaving him weak and bedridden in Naples. From his cot, he listened to the distant rumble of the front, frustrated to be sidelined. He missed the first wave of the Anzio landings, but by January 29th, he was back in the fight, his recovery swift under the urgency of war. At Anzio, the beachhead was a place of constant tension. The enemy was close, the shelling frequent, the air thick with smoke and the sharp tang of explosives. Weeks turned into months of holding the line each day, bringing its own tests. Murphy's actions here would earn him additional decorations, his composure under fire, a steadying force for those around him. One encounter in particular stayed with him, a German tank and its crew, destroyed not by larger guns, but by grenades hurled with precision and speed. It was the kind of desperate close quarters fighting that stripped away any illusion about war being distant or impersonal. By the summer of 1944, he had been in combat for well over a year. The Italian campaign had taught him hard lessons about leadership, about endurance, about the thin line between survival and loss. When Rome was liberated in June, his unit moved north, the city's ancient streets offering a brief, almost unreal pause in the long grind of war. The pause would not last. Soon new orders came carrying him and his comrades toward the next front, southern France, and the battles that would etch his name permanently into the history books. The summer of 1944 carried with it the scent of vineyards and the hum of cicadas. But for Audie Murphy, southern France was no postcard. It was another place where the land would soon be marked by the sound of gunfire and the tread of soldiers' boots. On August 15th, the Allies launched Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. Murphy was among the first wave to come ashore, near the small coastal village of Ramatuelle. The air was thick with salt and the acrid bite of burning powder. Landing craft slid onto the sand, their ramps clanging down as soldiers splashed into the shallows, rifles held high. The vineyard they moved into should have been peaceful rows of green, stretching neatly across the slope, the sun casting warm light through the leaves. But somewhere ahead, German forces waited. Their fire cracked suddenly through the air, forcing Murphy's squad to seek cover between the vines. He saw two German soldiers emerge from a small house about 100 yards away. Their hands were raised as if to surrender, and for a moment hope flickered that the fight might be over quickly. But when Murphy's closest friend called out in reply, the supposed surrender turned to treachery. Gunfire erupted, and his friend fell dead in the dirt. Something in Murphy hardened instantly. He broke from cover, charging toward the house through a storm of bullets. Inside, he moved with deadly precision. 6 enemy soldiers killed, 2 wounded, 11 taken prisoner. It was swift, ruthless work, born not of impulse, but of the cold, clear need to end the threat before it could claim more lives. In the weeks that followed, Murphy's actions seemed to mirror that same mix of quick judgment and steady nerve. On October 2nd, in the Cleury Valley, He silenced a German machine gun position, killing 4 and wounding 3 more. Just days later, he crawled alone toward another enemy position in Lomé, a radio in hand, calling artillery fire down so precisely that when his unit advanced, 15 Germans lay dead and 35 more wounded. The autumn air in the Vosges Mountains was sharp, the leaves turning gold and red. The hills were beautiful, but the fighting was relentless, close tangled, and often fought in shadows. On the road to Bruvilliers, Murphy's squad came under fire from snipers. In the sudden chaos, he managed to capture 2, only to take a bullet to the hip from a third hidden in the tree line. He returned fire instantly, the shot striking the sniper between the eyes. Each engagement left its mark. The victories were counted in yards gained in positions held, but they were paid for in lives. And as 1944 waned, the war was far from over. Then came the Colmar Pocket. It was January 1945, and the French region of Alsace lay under a deep, brittle cold. Snow blanketed the fields, muffling sound. Yet the air itself seemed to carry a sense of waiting, as if the land knew what was coming. The Germans had fortified their hold on an 850 square mile wedge of territory, and clearing it would require every ounce of resolve from the Allied forces. Murphy rejoined his unit Company B after recovering from wounds to both legs. The town of Holzwihr became their next objective, a name that would soon be forever linked to his own. The fight began brutally. Artillery shook the frozen ground, splintering trees into jagged spears. Machine guns hammered from hidden positions, and the cold made every movement slower, heavier. In the midst of the chaos, a German shell struck an American M10 tank destroyer, flames roaring up from its hull. The crew abandoned it, scrambling to safety. Murphy saw what had to be done. He ordered his men to withdraw into the shelter of the nearby woods, their voices reluctant but obedient. That left him alone on the open field. The snow crunched under his boots as he moved toward the burning M10, the heat from the fire clashing with the winter air. Climbing onto the tank destroyer, he took control of the 50 caliber machine gun mounted on its turret. The weapon's metal was cold under his hands, but it came alive in his grip, the heavy thump of each burst shaking through his body. Enemy infantry advanced across the white field, their figures dark against the snow. Murphy cut them down, methodically, burst after burst, the air around him filled with the sharp smell of cordite and the crack of incoming fire. For nearly an hour, he held his position, firing, calling in artillery over the radio, adjusting coordinates so that shells fell closer and closer to the enemy. The Germans pushed hard, their fire ripping chunks from the snow around him, but each time they surged forward, he met them with relentless precision. When the attack finally broke, the field in front of him was littered with bodies, 50 enemy soldiers, dead or wounded. Murphy, bleeding from his leg, climbed down from the blackened wreck and returned to his men. Without pause, he led the counterattack that drove the Germans completely from the area. For this, he would receive the Medal of Honor, the highest recognition his country could bestow. But to Murphy, it was simply the necessary thing to do. There had been no time to consider heroism, only survival. When the war finally loosened its grip on Europe, the guns fell silent. But for many men, the battle never truly ended. Audie Murphy returned to the United States in 1945 carrying not just a chest full of medals, but a mind full of ghosts. America greeted him as a hero. Newspapers printed his photograph, a young face with calm eyes, barely 20 years old, yet draped in honors that few men twice his age could claim. Parades rolled down city streets, speeches praised his courage, and strangers shook his hand as if touching him might transfer some of his steel. But inside, Murphy felt the weight of all he had seen. In the quiet of the night, memories broke through without warning, the smell of smoke and burning metal, the cold sting of snow under his boots at Holzwehr, the sudden silence after a comrade's voice was cut short by gunfire. He had learned in battle to push aside fear and grief. Now in peace, those things returned, demanding their place. Sleep became an enemy. He kept a loaded pistol under his pillow, its presence a comfort against the unease that settled in his chest when the lights went out. Sudden noises could make his pulse spike, his hands tightening before his mind could catch up. The war had given him a set of instincts that civilian life had no use for, and they refused to leave. The medical world of the late 1940s did not yet have the term post-traumatic stress disorder. Veterans like Murphy were expected to simply adjust, to take their place in peacetime America without complaint. But the battles still played out behind his eyes. In 1949, he married actress Wanda Hendricks. On the surface, their life together seemed charmed Hollywood parties, studio sets, the sheen of glamour. But Hendricks would later speak of the shadows in their home, of waking in the night to find Murphy pointing a gun at her in the grip of a nightmare, of watching him weep at newsreels showing orphaned children in war-torn Europe. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. Murphy fought back in the only way he knew, through determination. In the early 1960s, when he realized he had become dependent on the sedative Placidal to sleep, he locked himself in a motel room for a week to break the hold it had on him. He emerged shaky, but free proof that he could still face down an enemy, even one that lived inside him. Yet, he did not keep his struggles private. Murphy spoke openly about the difficulties faced by veterans, especially those returning from Korea and Vietnam. He lobbied for better mental health care, for more understanding of the invisible wounds carried by soldiers. In doing so, he gave a voice to countless men who might otherwise have suffered in silence. It was a fight that mattered to him as deeply as any he had fought in uniform. He knew too well the danger of a country turning away from its soldiers once the shooting stopped. Even as he battled his own restlessness, Murphy built a second career in Hollywood. The boy from Hunt County, who had once dreamed simply of wearing a uniform, found himself on movie posters, his name in bold letters. From 1948 to 1969, he appeared in over 40 films, westerns, war stories, dramas often playing characters cut from the same quiet, resilient cloth he knew so well. In 1955, he starred in To Hell and Back, a film adaptation of his own wartime memoir. Playing himself on screen meant reliving scenes he had lived through in flesh and blood. Some of the moments were softened for audiences, but the weight of them was real. Murphy once admitted that filming the battle sequences brought back feelings he had tried to bury. Still, he did it, perhaps sensing that telling the story honestly, even if painfully, was another kind of duty. Hollywood gave him a livelihood, but never a perfect fit. He remained at heart a soldier living in the civilian world. Friends remembered him as courteous, loyal, and modest, but always with a part of himself held back, as if some doors in his mind stayed locked. As the 1960s wore on, Murphy's life was a balance of work-family. He remarried and had 2 sons and his advocacy for veterans. The years had softened some edges, but the inner restlessness never fully left him. Then came May 28, 1971. Murphy was aboard a small private plane, flying through the fog and rain over Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. The weather closed in visibility, dropping to nothing. Somewhere near Catawba, the plane struck the slope of Brush Mountain. All aboard were killed instantly. He was 45 years old. On June 7, 1971, Audie Leon Murphy was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery. The service drew thousands of soldiers, statesmen, and ordinary citizens alike. George H.W. Bush, then the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, stood alongside General William Westmoreland and members of Murphy's beloved 3rd Infantry Division. Today his grave is among the most visited in Arlington. Visitors leave coins, flowers, and quiet words. Some come because they know the full measure of his life. Others because they have only heard the name, but sense that it belongs to someone who stood when standing was hardest. For Murphy, the war never truly ended, but in his life and in his death, he gave shape to the idea that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. In the quiet rows of Arlington National Cemetery, the seasons move with an almost ceremonial grace. Spring spreads a green carpet across the grounds. Summer bathes the headstones in warm light. Autumn lays a quilt of gold and crimson leaves, and winter wraps the land in stillness. Somewhere along those rows lies a simple white marker with the name Audie Leon Murphy. It does not shout its story. It stands like so many others in silence, the words etched into its surface, a condensed version of a life that could never truly be reduced to lines of text. Visitors stop there often. Some bend to read the dates: June 20th, 1925, May 28th, 1971. Some linger, perhaps, imagining the boy from Hunt County, Texas, or the young man on a burning tank destroyer in the snow at Holtzwihr. Murphy's legacy is both public and deeply personal. In the public record, he is the most decorated U.S. soldier of World War II, awarded every combat medal the Army could give, along with honors from France and Belgium. His name appears in history books, military museums, and films, but for those who look closer, his true legacy may be in the way he carried the weight of war long after the last battle ended, and in how he used his voice to speak for others who carried that same invisible load. Murphy knew that medals could shine, but they could not erase the shadows. He knew that courage was not only found in the charge against an enemy, but also in the long, patient fight to reclaim one's life afterward. In Hollywood, he left behind a body of work that, while varied, often circled back to the themes he knew best: endurance, loyalty, and the quiet heroism of ordinary men caught in extraordinary times. His memoir, To Hell and Back, remains one of the most enduring first-hand accounts of World War II. Its pages marked by the same plain-spoken honesty with which he lived. The hospital in San Antonio that bears his name, the Audie L. Murphy Memorial VA Hospital, continues to serve veterans. It stands as a reminder not only of his service in war, but also of his advocacy in peace. For many, it is a fitting tribute, a place of care and recovery. For those who, like Murphy, have walked through the fire and returned with scars the world may never fully see. Time has a way of turning even the most vivid lives into history, but some stories resist fading. Murphy's is one of them. Perhaps it is because his journey was never simple. He was not a flawless hero carved from marble. He was human, brave, stubborn, haunted, and deeply aware of the cost of the things he had done. That complexity makes his story not just inspiring, but real. If you were to stand now at his grave, you might notice the way the wind moves through the nearby trees, carrying with it the faint scent of grass and stone, warmed by the sun. You might hear the distant cadence of footsteps, soldiers on ceremonial duty, their boots striking the path with steady rhythm. In that moment, it's easy to imagine Murphy himself, somewhere beyond sight, standing quietly at ease, watchful as ever. His life began in the dust of rural Texas, passed through the smoke and chaos of battlefields half a world away, and ended in the green folds of the Virginia mountains. Along the way, he became a symbol of something America has always valued. In its best moments, the willingness to step forward when the odds are poor and the outcome uncertain. And so, as the light fades over Arlington and the day gives way to evening, his story settles into the larger chorus of those who served. Each marker, each name, a note in the long, low song of memory. Murphy's note is strong, clear, and lasting. Perhaps, if you listen closely enough, you might hear it not as a shout, but as a steady, quiet voice, the kind that speaks when it matters most. Hold the line. Take care of your own. Never give up. That is the legacy of Audie Leon Murphy.